We look at Native American genetics and we don't find any mitochondrial DNA from, say, European or Middle Eastern DNA. Well, it turns out that mitochondrial DNA is only transmitted through the female lineage, and so males can't pass it on.
Wouldn't have mattered. Yeah.
Where we do have some very interesting evidence is in what's called human leukocyte antigens, HLAs, and it's a blood factor. It's a pretty specific marker of where you came from originally. And we find that Middle Eastern and Southern Asian HLAs, not just one or another, but a number of them clustering together in a particular area in Native America. How are you going to explain that if it isn't by somebody coming over and introducing those?
Let's talk about pre-Columbian oceanic voyage. And you'll forgive me my ignorance about a lot of these things. I'm just here to sort of pick your brain and kind of learn a little bit, but we're talking about global oceanic travel. So from what, the old world to the new, one way or the other kind of a thing? Pacific, Atlantic, Indian? I mean, what oceans are we talking about?
Well, as a professor, I would say all of the above. Of course, the cliche that we were all taught as school pupils is that in the year 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he was the first to get across any major ocean. As they might say today, ain't, in my region anyway, in Southwest Virginia. The fact of the matter is humans were extraordinarily mobile and in a maritime fashion from very, very early times. And Columbus was a latecomer as far as all that went.
So when you say very early times, how far back are we talking?
Paleolithic.
When is that?
And so certainly we had people going to fairly remote islands, 40,000, 30,000 years ago.
Oh, no kidding.
Maybe
Okay.
even more. This was particularly in Indonesia and out into the Melanesian islands to the east of New Guinea. And we have carbon-14 dates from human occupations there that go back 25, 30, 35, 40,000 years ago. As I say, on some of these islands are pretty remote and hundreds of miles from the next island, or at least 150 miles or so from the next island. So people had capable watercraft. They had some significant degree of skill in navigation, probably celestial navigation, and we're doing that. Now, they didn't probably get to the New World that early from the Old World by sea.
How early, how far back do we have evidence that there was Old World to New World oceanic?
I would say the earliest really good evidence, and that is biological evidence, which you can't manufacture, you can't reinvent in the other hemisphere. Biological entities have their places of origin, and they're usually at least initially, their hemispheres of distribution. We have intestinal parasites in human burials from Brazil that go back more than 6,000 BC. And
these parasites would have originated?
They're old world parasites. They're tropical or subtropical parasites that could not have come around the Bering Strait region in the north because the climate didn't permit. And so
they must have come
so I don't think
via shipping of some kind.
Yeah, somebody got across. And these are human parasites. And
that's irrefutable. I mean,
well, nobody's really questioned that. They just have ignored it.
I wonder why that is.
Well, there's a great mindset against this whole concept of connections between the old and new worlds before Columbus. And there are a multiplicity of reasons for that. The first being, well, it's just the oceans are too wide and watercraft were inadequate. And until Columbus got the idea, they thought they'd fall off the edge of the ocean, just a few miles offshore of Europe. And of course, well, I say, of course, it's not obvious, obviously, to everybody, but in fact, the spherical Earth theory, for example, was known to the ancient Greeks by at least 500 BC. Was known in
No
India. Was
kidding.
known in China, in pre-Christian
So
times.
why would this flat Earth thing make a resurgence, or in the Columbus's days, if they already
Well,
knew?
it turns out if you look at the historical records, there were very, very few flat earthers, even back in medieval times. It's the general perception is that, oh yeah, they were all flat earthers because the Bible didn't talk about the other side of the world or anything like that. Well, in fact, there may be a place in the Bible where it does indicate sphericity, but without getting into that, the medieval thinkers, there were a few exceptions, a few flat earthers, but for the most part, most medieval scholars, I'm not talking about the general population, were quite acquainted with the spherical Earth idea. Columbus didn't come up with that on his own. He read some of the classic writings, and
I guess that makes sense. Yeah. So, one of the problems is that the oceans are just too big and too wide. What were the other reasons that people have trouble with
if you
transoceanic?
don't mind me returning to that
Yes.
concept,
No, not at all.
it is the oceans are significantly wide east to west in their middles, particularly the Pacific, of course. But what about going around the edge of the ocean? If you're in Asia, for example, you just go up from Japan to the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia, and then or on the Aleutian Islands chain, and there's no gap
That's
more than
true.
a couple hundred, 250 or so miles. And so, it's no big deal getting across the ocean in the northern latitudes. On the Atlantic side, you can go from Norway or from Scotland. If you're in Scotland, you go the Orkneys, then the Shetlands, and then the Faroe Islands that belong to Norway. And then it's only, I don't know, 250 miles to Iceland and another 100 or 150 to Greenland. So it's no big deal.
Well, I mean, you jump on any airplane and you go transcontinental, and you pretty much go up and follow
Well,
the
yeah,
curvature.
it's a great circle
It's a
route
much-
anyway, which
yeah.
is the shortest route across.
Shortest route.
So it's a matter of perception. And it's also, the general cliche is that watercraft were inadequate until Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal and his minions invented the caravel, which had a stern rudder and it had multiple masts and sails and big capacity to carry supplies and could take cannon and so on. Well, in fact, watercrafts have been available for thousands of years or were entirely capable of crossing the oceans. Take the Polynesians, for example, who now it is clear reached South America, came all the way across from the west side of the Pacific out of Asia, crossed island by island for the most part, but ultimately got to South America. And we have Polynesian chickens in late pre-Columbian South America. We have the South American sweet potato in Polynesia.
Stop. Polynesian chickens?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So I guess that's biological evidence.
It is. And that's, I in my book, I have a great deal of emphasis on that. And it's definitive as far as I can.
Are there other animal things or other biological
There
things
are,
like
yeah,
that?
there may be 20, 25 species of cultivated plants and domesticated animals that are found on the wrong side of the ocean in archaeological sites of pre-Columbian age. And, you might, maybe some fluke you might have gotten one, or like the coconut could have floated across on its own, something like that.
Cliched coconut,
But
yeah.
you're not going to get 20 of those that are not capable even of surviving in the wild without human intervention. Most crop plants cannot. If you planted a cornfield and got a crop and just left it and never came back to it for 10 years, you think you'd find corn growing in it? No, corn can't replicate itself. It's been so changed under domestication that it needs human intervention to actually exist. And that's an extreme example, but most of these crop plants, pretty much require some human cultivation or something.
And you can, science can trace where they originated.
Yeah.
With certainty.
Every crop plant has its wild ancestor, or in a few cases, more than one wild ancestor, where it's hybridization. And you can pretty much track down pretty exactly where that point of origination was. And it's with a few minor exceptions, it's quite clear which hemisphere, at least, these things originated in. Corn in the New World, potatoes in the New World, tomatoes in the New World, wheat, barley, rice in the Old World, and all those things. So there's no question for most species on that front.
And so there's evidence that those plants and those species were going from one world to the other before Columbus, essentially.
Yes, and some of them quite early, astoundingly early, like the bottle gourd. Now there's some slight potential that could have crossed floating and been taken up by the natives on the other side, but
still,
it's highly unlikely. And tests have shown so far that it doesn't float that long to get across. But they go back, a couple thousand years BC in the New World. They're an African domesticate. Yeah, the evidence is pretty clear pretty early.
Is there then actual watercraft evidence?
There's from Bronze Age time, even Neolithic times on, there's quite a bit of watercraft evidence in the Old World, not so much in the New. The New World watercraft were not nearly as capable as the Old World ones were. The most significant long-distance sailing craft that existed in the New World was the balsa log raft, sailing raft, and they had masts and sails, and they had a method of steering which involved what they called dagger boards. They were long, thin boards that could be put down between the logs at various points to cause the thing to go this way or that way. And that same system is found on the coast of China and Vietnam and South Asia. And so it's a very intricate and sophisticated system of watercraft steering and sailing, duplicated on the two sides. The raft use in the New World was concentrated in Ecuador, and those rafts sailed up and down the Pacific coast of the Americas, as far south as Chile, as far north as Mexico, maybe even up to the mouth of the Colorado River. They were trading in spondylus shell, which was a sacred shell that they used in crafts and so on. And probably, I think they were also trading in cotton up and down that coast, and textiles, probably, other things too.
The travel between continents was on both sides of the American. In other words, it was they were coming back and forth from the Orient to the Occident, whatever we call us.
That's the impression that is given. A lot of this has not been pinned down in terms of specific contacts at specific times and places, hasn't been pinned down exactly and proven definitively. But the picture, to me, looks as though there was a particular connection with Eastern Asia in early times, as far back as the Neolithic in Asia and what they call the formative in the New World. And that's, as far back as at least 2000 BC. And there are cultural commonalities between archaic China and Mesoamerica that I think originated back that far back in time and were transferred from Asia to the Americas. Much later in time, it looks as though there was a South Asian and Indonesian and Southeast Asian connection with Mexico and such places in the New World. It seems to have been a sort of Hindu-Buddhist influence on Mesoamerican cultures and their religion. But there were also apparently some reciprocal exchanges from particularly Maya culture to uh, especially Indonesian, like Java and Bali. And there were some aspects of Maya culture that seem to have been exchanged back in that direction. So,
Yeah, and what other method could there be? I mean, except via
yeah,
crossing
well,
these oceans.
you
I
have, of
mean,
course, the alternative theory that these were independent inventions, uh, which could have been like uh, making a basket or or a spear point or a piece of pottery, which are very utilitarian things that you might reinvent. I'm skeptical, but you might. On the other hand, these things include such things that, like the Maya, have depictions of certain deities and monsters with eyes that, instead of having just a pupil or an iris, they have a spiral. Now you find that again in Java and Bali. And that's what we call an arbitrary trait. It's not something that would just come to mind naturally
yes.
or have any utilitarian value. Uh, so things of that sort, those are like the trace elements in geology that we use in cultural studies to signal interactions. If you have strange, not requisite, not even logical things that are shared, it puts up a red flag.
Yes, indeed.
And so,
More than just a coincidence, really. I mean,
yeah, it's very unexpectable. And some of these sharings are really pretty extraordinary. I just mentioned one. Then this is widespread in Asia and even in Ireland, actually, but particularly in southern and eastern Asia and in Mexico and areas influenced from Mexico. It's a concept of existence uh, as being a series of layered worlds, and people came from the lower worlds and climbed up and to the next world after a series of disasters, floodings usually in the lower worlds. And each world, vertically speaking, has a different color. Now, when they get to the present world, each direction of the present, each cardinal direction, east, west, south, north, has assigned to it a color, a deity, a sacred plant, an animal, and sometimes human characteristics and so forth. And these two systems are shared on both sides of the Pacific. And I don't think you're going to reinvent that whole complex independently.
wow.
So
That's
just my idea, but
well, but yeah, I mean, yeah, while we may not be able to provide direct evidence that they were in fact coming from one side or the other, the fact that you can make those relationships is pretty cool. I mean,
yeah, cool. That's a technical term.
that's
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, that's why I used it. I knew only you would really understand.
Yes, yes.
These knuckleheads, they don't
No,
talk on
it's
our
the
level.
jargon of our
Yes.
scientific efforts.
Are there any other evidences that are powerful like these that you're? I like the track that you're
yeah,
on. Kind of talking.
there are quite a few of them, but I mean those are some of the best examples I know. Um, it's often the whole idea of transoceanic contacts and exchanges has been criticized on the basis that there are supposedly no old world artifacts that have ever showed up in the New World in a pre-Columbian context, and same vice versa in the Old World of New World items. And that's largely true, but there have been a few found. And of course, we always keep our eyes open for such things. Much of the problem is that most of them have been found in contexts that you can't say, well, an archaeologist trained in his field and with good dating methods and stratigraphic placement and all of that sort of stuff has found it. Usually, some campesino in Mexico digs in his field and hey, here's a Buddha figure. And there have been several of those found in that kind of fashion. In a pre-Columbian pyramid in Mexico, there was a burial that a Mexican archaeologist unearthed undisturbed. And he found in this burial a terracotta head, portrait head, and it's a Roman manufacture and dates, I think, to the 1st century AD. And it was in good archaeological context, found by a professional archaeologist and not just a surface find found by somebody who, just ordinary guy. So that's one of the few good examples.
That's a pretty
But it's
darn
a pretty
good
good
one.
one. Now, does that mean the Romans were there? Not necessarily. It's a Roman object, but it does not have to have been carried by a Roman person, and it doesn't have to have come over in Roman times, but just at least sometime before Columbus.
Right. Almost irrelevant who carried it over, but
Yeah,
the
at
fact
least it
that
shows there was
Yeah.
something carried from the old world in pre-Columbian times. So,
wow. Do we know if that's in a museum somewhere? Is it anything that he's showing?
It's probably in the National Museum of Mexico somewhere, I would think. I don't know offhand where it's housed, but I think it's probably there.
Yeah. Wow.
That the distance from West Africa to Brazil is less than the distance from the mouth of the Red Sea to the south tip of India, which the Romans and the Greeks before them were plying on a regular basis in the Indian Ocean. They were going longer out to sea routes in the Indian Ocean than it is between Brazil and Africa.
So the
And
very
so if they could go
idea,
that direction, they could go
Right.
the other direction.
the very idea that it's just too far
Yeah.
is
There's
ludicrous.
very much the perceptions interfere with the actual objective seeing of reality. And as I mentioned, you can go around the perimeter of the oceans without ever getting more than 150 miles out of sight of land.
Are there that we know of any objects or evidence or anything up at near the tops, up in those, or down in the bottoms?
Just a couple of very late things. There's an archaic Chinese bronze that recently has been found in Alaska, I think the Seward Peninsula, but the site itself is late pre-Columbian, so it's not of great consequence. They've also found some apparently late pre-Columbian Venetian glass beads in another site in Alaska. But again, it's pre-Columbian, but it's I don't know, 1200s or something like that, or 1400s. So it's not very far back in time.
Right.
Before.
But still
1400s.
pre-Columbian. I mean,
It's still pre-Columbian. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's
And there was trade across the Bering Strait, forever. That you can take a kayak across there. It's 56 miles, I think, or 54 miles. And there's an island in the middle, and you can walk across it on the ice in the wintertime, or at least you could before global warming.
right. So you could walk across the ice and come over to the American continent and then go all the way down to Brazil.
Yeah, you
and
could
drop a coin out of your pocket
you
into
could,
a Mexican
you could walk
or
from,
whatever.
You could walk from Portugal to the southern tip of South America and Chile. You wouldn't have a watercraft.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, the original populators of the hemisphere coming from Asia crossed Beringia, which was the dry land Bering Strait during lower sea level times. They of course didn't wet their feet either. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I like
But the hemispheres are not that separate, is what I'm saying, geographically speaking.
Yeah, our perception is that it just, for the doubters, it would seem it's too long ago. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the understanding. They had to navigate by the stars. It would have been too hard, too long.
Yeah.
And
and also the perception that the seas were so terrible and stormy and huge waves. And, we get this from our popular literature and movies and so on, the dangers of crossing the oceans. And it can be dangerous. You go to hurricane season and you probably wouldn't survive. But knowledge built up as to which seasons were the appropriate seasons, the storm-free seasons, the seasons in which the winds were going in the appropriate directions, and so on and so on. And, they didn't take chances they didn't have to.
Pre-Columbian Old World citizens, people, were no dummies. And again,
Well,
another technical term.
that's right. That is, yeah.
I mean, they.
As I said in a recent article, even these people, we have now evidence that Neanderthals and Denisovan hominins, which are similar to Neanderthals, were making some not huge crossings, but significant crossings. These, as I said in the article, these are not the knuckle dragging cretins of cartoon cliche.
But that that sort of perception gets propagated and believed and followed century after century, year after year.
Everybody
till we
knows
just
that you
accept
can't
it.
cross oceans,
Right,
so
sure.
we don't need to really
Like
take
you
a
led
look.
with, everybody knows that Christopher Columbus discovered America,
Yeah,
when in fact there were people there long before
yeah.
him.
So, well, yeah, not only people there who came by the Bering Strait region, but people who did traverse the oceans. It seems pretty clear now.
I love that.
And we also have some genetic evidence. Genetic evidence. I remember one popular article that said, well, we look at Native American genetics and we don't find any mitochondrial DNA from Europe or Africa or Asia. Well, Asia, yes, because they came from Asia, but say European or Middle Eastern DNA, mitochondrial DNA, which is what they started out using as the big thing in these genetic studies. Well, it turns out that mitochondrial DNA is only transmitted through the female lineage, and so males can't pass it on.
Wouldn't have mattered. Yeah.
But where we do have some very interesting evidence is in what's called human leukocyte antigens, HLAs. And it's a blood factor. I can't give you a technical explanation on short notice, but
that's fair. Blood factor works for our purposes.
And it's genetically controlled and it's extremely variable. And so you have lots of different ones, the different variants of it. And so it's a pretty specific marker of where you came from originally. And we find that Middle Eastern and Southern Asian and Eastern Asian HLAs, not just one or another, but a number of them clustering together in a particular area in Native America exist. And, how are you going to explain that if it isn't by somebody coming over and introducing those?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, how do they even find that? Where are they getting their samples?
Well, because it's of medical significance, huge numbers of samples have been taken of HLAs all around the world from living populations.
Just from the people?
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
I don't know that there's any ancient DNA findings on HLAs, but in contemporary people I'm talking about, yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, the main thesis here is that the world many, many years ago was a much smaller place than, because of shipping, because of transoceanic voyages. It was a kind of almost a global community to some degree.
Exactly. I see it as a sort of prototype of a world system, a global network of interconnections, interactions, trade relations, migrations, explorations. And I think humans very early on just went every place they could.
Yes.
Not everybody, many people just preferred to stay home, but there was always that portion of the population that had the wandering gene.
Yes.
And I think they, from the beginning, wanted to know what was over the horizon, what was around the bend, what was down the river, what was across the ocean. And they went and looked, and they had the means to do it pretty early. And I would be very astonished if people didn't make these traverses. And even if they didn't, if they had any maritime activity along the coasts, as they did, if you had a storm come up, took your mast out, took your rudder out, or you removed your steering oars, you were at a loss and you couldn't control the craft, and the prevailing winds and currents would have taken you right across. and no
So
problem.
even by accident,
By
people
accident. So
probably would
accidental
have.
discovery was, I think, just routine, you might say, as was intentional exploration. So you can't keep everybody at home. They want to go see what's over there. And some of them died, some of them succeeded. It doesn't matter how many died as long as some succeeded.
Yeah.
Each of the major ocean basins, that is North Atlantic, South Atlantic, North Pacific, South Pacific, and Indian Ocean, has what we call a gyre. It actually has two gyres. One is water gyre, and the other is an atmospheric gyre. The atmospheric gyre, a gyre is sort of a spiral, outward spiraling kind of phenomenon, and the winds spiral out from the centers or from the high pressure areas that exist over each of these basins,
Right.
and they create prevailing winds. That is, the winds that are most of the time in operation, not all the time, but most of the time. And they in the northern hemisphere, these winds spiral out and then become increasingly east-west in the trade wind zones, and you have those winds running across the surface of the sea, and the friction between those winds, prevailing winds, and the surface of the sea causes the surface waters to start moving, and so you have an oceanic gyre that sort of mirrors the atmospheric gyre. And so you have the two pretty much going in the same direction, and forms these big sort of circular systems around each of these major ocean basins. And so uh, a watercraft that was disabled and it was in one of these gyres or pairs of gyres would automatically be taken across the other side. And so it was inevitable that watercraft would be crossing the ocean. You couldn't avoid it, historically speaking. So it gives a little different perspective than.
And you're talking about a period of thousands
Yeah,
of
and over
years.
thousands of years, you're going to have thousands of watercraft.
Yes. Yeah.
And given enough time, anything can happen.
And over thousands of years of this history, the people who we've already established aren't dummies. They recognize these patterns, and they recognize that they can take advantage
they became
of them
familiar
too.
with these and learned about the major currents, and then took advantage of them. In the Indian Ocean, for example, there was the so-called monsoon winds, which were early exploited. In the wintertime, they go out from Asia, and in the summertime, they come in from Asia. And so the traders timed their voyaging to correspond with the direction they wanted to go and the wind system they wanted to take advantage of. And so they go out on the one and come back on the other. And so that was characteristic of that basin for I don't know how many thousands of years. The use of that system.
Are there specific places you can name today that are like would be ideal launching points going in either direction?
Yeah.
What would be a good place for someone?
An ideal place to start a transatlantic voyage would be the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands lie off of present-day Morocco, Spanish Sahara, and the Romans were active in a small-scale way in the Canaries.
Now, was that ultimately where Columbus also left from? Because I know
he went by way of the
Spain
Canaries.
somewhere.
Yes, yeah, he came down from Spain and by the Canaries, and then across the Atlantic.
So he would have been, based on our conversation, essentially following.
Yes, well established. At least as far as the Canaries,
Yeah.
we don't know for sure whether the Romans or their predecessors continued on across. We do have in the great harbor of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil what appears to be a Roman Roman-style shipwreck that contains amphorae, wine or oil containing ceramic containers that were manufactured on the coast of Morocco. And it's a very interesting tale because a lot of people who got involved in it had their own agendas. The story in brief is this. Some of the people that fished in the bay there brought up in their nets some of these amphorae, and they had them in their backyards and so on. And this American adventurer, Robert Marks, heard about this when he was in Rio, and he looked into it. And he's a diver as well as various other things. And he identified a target out in the bay and dove on it and found bits of hull and more amphorae encrusted with barnacles and so on. And I think he managed to get a few of these. And then he was roughly removed from this site by the Brazilian government, and the Brazilian government proceeded to dump dredge tailings or something all over this site to cover it up, and has not since allowed anybody to examine this site. And
So this is just him reporting on it.
Yeah. Well, he has photographs and so on, but yeah, and I don't recollect whether they confiscated any of his materials, but the scuttlebutt is, and I can't guarantee this is the truth, is that the Brazilian government got exercised by the thought that a Roman ship could have been there before the Portuguese discovery by Cabral in the Age of Discovery from Europe, because that might give, and there are a lot of Italians in Brazil, that might give the Italians a claim on Brazil.
Yeah, I'm sure that
that's one
theory.
bit of gossip anyway.
The fact is that if there is a Roman vessel sunk in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, and it really is Roman. Yeah. I mean, when I think Roman, I'm thinking about the time of Jesus or something. I mean, that's well before Columbus.
Yeah, a few centuries, yes. And there are some other sites in the New World too. I think there's one in Honduras and there's one in Texas that have been alleged to be Roman shipwreck sites. I can't vouch for either of them at the moment, but
well, hearsay is still fun to talk about.
Well, you have to hear about these things before you can investigate.
I guess that's true.
And so you can pick up on gossip.
Yeah.
And take a look. I'm not doing field work these days underwater, but at age 85.
No, you're 85, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I mean,
yeah, well,
you don't, you don't seem like an 85-year-old.
I'm trying to look a mere 70.
They say 85 is the new 83.
Yeah. Hey, that's my line.
Let me go to the other side of the world for a minute now that you've talked a lot about the Asian side of things. And I asked the question, was there any ideal place, maybe a good launching point? And you talked about the Canary Islands. Can you think of any place over on the other side now that would have been a good place for them to set sail or to push off? I mean, are there places that they would be able to take advantage of, either a shorter distance or a good winds and currents, or what does that look like?
It's not quite as restricted over there as it is on the Atlantic side. Any place along the coast of East Asia, I would say Chinese ports, any of them, Japanese ports would have been suitable. I looked at South China particularly as a potential source of watercraft and development and navigational skills. South China gave rise, among others, other cultures, to the Austronesian culture, which became the most maritime, expansive culture of all human history. The Austronesian is a language family. It includes Polynesian, Indonesian, Micronesian, Melanesian, the native population of Madagascar speaks a Austronesian language, which originated in Borneo, and so they have covered in their settlement, just in their settlement, you know, at least half the circumference of the globe, and
Yeah.
they probably went on to West Africa at least. And we find now, very recently, it's been found that they're in the genetics of a Native American group in Paraguay, I believe it is there are some Polynesian type genes. We find some Austronesian vocabulary in some of the native languages of the Amazon basin. Uh, and of course, I've mentioned already the chickens, that Polynesian chickens
chicken, yeah.
and other things that arrived on the coast of Chile. And we think there's probably also a connection with Ecuador, where it probably was from Ecuador that the sweet potato was carried from South America into Polynesia, either by the Ecuadorians or brought back by Polynesians. So Austronesians are among the biggest suspects in a lot of this transmission of but they're not as early as some of the stuff I've been talking about.
Would it be too obvious to ask if we know, are there records of any kind, writings of anything that can corroborate that this was going on back then?
That's often been a criticism, the fact that that there seems to be a lack of historical records of any of these voyages. At least two things can be said about that. One is that such records, if these records were made in the first place, they would have been state secrets. You wouldn't want to share this information with your political rivals and trade rivals elsewhere, and so you'd keep this to yourself. You wouldn't put it in the public record. That sort of thing didn't come until the Europeans got this idea of claiming new lands by right of discovery. That's a relatively
like Italy claiming Brazil, for example.
yes, potentially yes. But
what would be the other reason why they wouldn't have had written records?
Well, in a lot of cases, these discoveries were made by illiterate people.
Oh, okay, I thought it would be obvious.
Literacy was rather limited. I mean, none of these Austronesians had any written language. Chinese, yes. Japanese, yes, but not Austronesians.
So you're left with literally just the remains of their culture.
Yeah, you've got their pottery.
You've got their chickens. You've got their
right, you have material remains, maybe genetic traces.
Yeah.
But you don't have any written records.
Yeah.
From a lot of these groups.
It's fascinating. Wow.
So there are a couple of accounts in the Chinese historical literature which could be interpreted as accounts of transoceanic voyages from China. One involves a mariner whose name was Xu Fu. I can't tell you the exact date of the document, but at the moment, I believe just starting about as we speak, he is initiating with another guy, this Danish fellow. He's initiating a rowing voyage from China to Japan, then from Japan up the Russian coast, and I guess across by the Aleutians by rowboat over into Alaska to reconstruct what he interprets. He's a sinologist, by the way. What he interprets as the probable route of this Shufu going from China to the New World on that itinerary.
And when would that supposedly have taken place?
Well, I can't remember the time exactly, but long ago.
Yes.
Centuries and centuries ago. There's another account, even older one, that has also been interpreted as a New World itinerary. So there are some possible accounts, but they're not totally clear. They weren't as good as the present day in writing these things up in a systematic fashion. So there's some ambiguity in some of these things, so we can't say for sure.
And there's been other voyages made in the spirit
Experimental
of
voyages,
yeah,
yes.
experimental
The whole
voyages.
topic of experimental voyages is a major one, and is very telling, I think. It involves creation of replica watercraft, replicas of ancient kinds of watercraft, and then making voyages in these watercraft with using the sailing techniques and often the, not always, but often the navigational techniques of the ancients. And this has been done with Chinese junk. It's been of Han Dynasty vintage. It's been done with a skin-covered uh, Celtic boat from Ireland to the New World. It's been done, of course, with Thor Heyerdahl has done it with both balsa log raft, the Kontiki, and also with papyrus rafts, reed rafts, bundle rafts, uh, going out from South America to the Polynesian islands. Well, no, the reed bundle ones, they were done across the Atlantic, I should say, from Africa to the New World, to Barbados, I think it
Were
was.
these people, were they doing it just to see if it could be done?
See if it could be done. Show that these watercraft were capable using empiricism. You know,
Yes.
let's check it out.
Let's do it ourselves.
That's another technical term, checking it out.
Yeah. The lexicon grows.
Yes. And they have been criticized on the basis that they really didn't know what they were doing, and but at the same time they did know what they were doing, in terms of knowing there was a continent across the ocean, and knowing if they went far enough they'd hit it, whereas the ancients didn't know that.
No idea.
But I counter that criticism by saying that these experimental voyagers were naive in terms of the kind of, and degree and quantity of knowledge that the ancients had. They were professional shipbuilders and mariners. They were professional navigators.
A beautiful
They weren't
point.
just these academics or adventurers that just said, let's try it.
They're not home on their barca-loungers where the critics are saying, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. Hey, we at least did it, buddy.
What kind of lounge did you say?
Barca-lounger.
Barca-lounge?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the barca-lounge, but
lazy
bark,
boy,
of course, means a boat.
It does. Yes. Wow. It's weird how it all ties together.
Yes.
We're coming up with our own language.
Exactly. I think it's very productive.
Little by little. Who would you say would have been considered the most successful of the experimental voyagers, and why would they have been considered successful?
That has varied quite a bit, the degree of success of the voyages. Thor Heyerdahl has to be given the first credit because he was the pioneer in doing this. Well, there was a Norse ship replica that was sailed across in 1893, I believe. But other than that, Heyerdahl was the first experimental voyager. And he built the Kontiki and sailed from South America to the Marquesas Islands.
And that was what, in the 40s or 50s, or when?
1947, I believe. Mm-hmm. And then he did these other voyages that I mentioned, the raw voyages across the Atlantic.
And his background was not as a sailor, shipbuilder. What was he?
Well, he was a Norwegian who got interested in sort of the romance of the South Pacific, and he and his wife at the time went out to some remote island and lived there, like natives and so forth. And he got increasingly interested in the archaeology of these islands and, how did these people get here and so on. And so when he got home, he started reading up on that. And he was particularly influenced by a lot of German scholars that had come before him. He started working on that, and he found it difficult to get anybody interested in it, but ultimately he managed and did the thing, and he was a great success not only in making the voyage without major mishap until he landed on a reef and the thing broke up, but that was at the island.
At least he was.
He got there.
He hit land. Yeah.
he was also successful in the sense that it caught the public attention, and he was pretty good at working that, and he became a pop culture phenomenon, and even ended up having a series of Kon-Tiki restaurants, you may remember. Uh, and so he was therefore not much appreciated by the professional scholars whose works sold maybe a few hundred books, and and they got no royalties.
Yeah, no movie
And no
rights.
movie.
Yeah, no Hollywood deals.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, too
Um,
bad for them.
but no, I give Heyerdahl a lot of credit. He had his own point of view. He ignored contrary evidence. He wasn't right in some of his major theorizings, but he put his money where his mouth was, or he put his life on the line to show it could be done.
Did you ever have any opportunities to do that, to get on any of those boats? Or
No, I did. I did give a paper in a session that was chaired by Heyerdahl in 1966 in Mar del Plata, Argentina. But I never, as I often say, I like reading about these things. I like writing about them, but I don't want to do it.
I'm exactly the same. I find it fascinating, but I have no desire
Yeah,
to step on one of those.
but more power to them. Yeah, so Heyerdahl was the pioneer, and he really put it on the map, this kind of thing. And others of these replica voyagers, were inspired by him. And Tim Severin, who was mentioned, he was an Irish guy who did a number of these things. He did the Brendan voyage in a skin-covered boat across the North Atlantic from island group to island group.
How big would these boats have been?
I don't know. That might have been 30 feet long, something like that.
I mean, when you think about transoceanic, pre-Columbian, old school oceanic crossing, I mean, what sort of craft do you envision? Is it a large boat? Because it seemed like you would need to have a lot of space for things.
Well, that's another nautical myth, that you need the wider the ocean, the larger the boat. That is not the case. The safest boat size is apparently around 30, 35 feet long. The larger boats are problematic if the waves get too big, because you'll have the middle of the boat on top of a wave, and then you'll have the ends of the boats in the troughs. The thing can crack like that, break the back, break the keel. So the shorter boats don't have that problem, but they're big enough to deal with the waves. And you don't have to have a hugely capacious craft to carry enough supplies to make the voyage. You fish.
Just
And
throw a
in
line
fact,
over.
as Heyerdahl and many others have discovered, if you're voyaging in tropical waters in a low-lying craft, every night you wake up in the morning, the bottom of the boat's full of flying fish that have come and didn't see the craft and landed in it instead of in the water. And so your breakfast and your lunch and your dinner is there. So you don't need to have a lot of supply.
A spin on manna from heaven, really.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
The whole mythology is a very Eurocentric one, and but even the Europeans of later days don't give credit to their ancestors for what they could do. I'm certain that Europeans, going back maybe even in BC, had made it across. They had adequate craft, and why wouldn't they?
What about the Vikings? I mean, they were well before Columbus, right? Weren't they?
Well, they were before Columbus, but not that
that far. Not that, yeah.
Like Leif Erikson came across around the year 1000, maybe closer to 110. But anyway, yeah, that was only 400 4 or 500 years before Columbus. That's nothing, because we're talking about some possibilities that go way back in time. I mean, startling to me, who's been interested in this stuff ever since my grad school days. The antiquity. I mean, these intestinal parasites in Brazil, for example, 6,000 something BC. Who'd have thunk it?
Wow.
I suspect they must have come over from Africa some way, maybe an accidental voyage and even a dugout canoe.
Is there any chance that birds could possibly fly that far and have things that they share from continent to continent? Or
That's a good question. One raises that issue with respect to cultivated plants. Could they have brought seeds across? In most cases, no. Very few birds do make the crossing. Those that do would mainly do it in the north, or are Arctic birds that are migrating past all of this and coming from outside the agricultural areas.
yes, yeah.
So they don't have too much potential. I think one plant, the purslane, probably was brought from Europe by birds to North America, but that's the only example I think there's any plausible case for. And certainly not these diseases or intestinal parasites that are.
Those would have been human-born.
Yeah, they're human. I don't know what other critters they might or might not infect, but probably not birds.
Any other animals that came from aside from the chickens? Is there evidence that there's been animals from other continents that shouldn't be on this continent or on that continent, or vice versa?
Well, there's some evidence for the turkey getting to medieval Europe, and probably before that, Turkey, and before that, Spain, India, but that's not for sure yet. Other animals, there are a couple of possibles. Nothing comes into my mind
Well,
at the
don't
moment.
break your brain over it.
But back in the 90s, I guess it was, maybe even the 80s, but I think in the 90s, a pathologist in the justice system in Munich, Germany, Svetlana Balabanova. Sorry, Svetlana.
Maybe if you said it in Chinese, it would be easier.
Anyway, she's actually a Bulgarian by birth, but she worked there in Munich, and she did routinely. She tested drug users and so on in a forensic sense. But she got interested in wondering whether any of the Egyptian mummies in the local museum in Munich. There's an very fine Egyptian museum in Munich, and she asked them if she could take some samples of these mummies and test them for drugs. And so she did. They gave the permission, and she did it. And she found residues in the hair and in the flesh and in the bones of these various mummies or mummified body parts from the museum of not only nicotine, which is, of course, from tobacco, which is a New World domesticate and wild plant, but also cocaine, which comes from the coca shrub, which is a South American domesticate. And there's no native either nicotine or cocaine or coca in the old world.
And they drug tested the security guards at the museum to make sure that they weren't high when they were watching the mummies.
That issue was actually raised, the issue of contamination of early museum people who were less than careful, and later museum people who were less than sober. The earlier ones with their stogies bending over the.
That's what I mean. Yeah, that seems.
Or later ones with whatever form they had cocaine. Yeah, they were probably just casually spilling expensive cocaine powder on these mummies. But the thing is,
they ruled that out, certainly.
Well, there's still people still saying that.
Okay.
But the problem is that these mummies absorb. You can tell by the chemistry and the locations, absorbed the alkaloid, the drug, while still living in vivo. They can't absorb it in their hair from these potential external contaminants. It was taken in before these mummies were mummified.
So the mummies were on drugs.
The mummies were on drugs.
The people who were mummified before they died were partying.
That's it. So,
but where did they get it?
Where did they get it? Well, they didn't get it locally. People have tried to find local plants that could have provided either of these substances and have failed to do so. It's a complex investigation, mainly done by me. and some other scientists that know how to do these things. I just have put some of the information together, but I have done none of the testing. But I learned that there are apparently naturalized coca shrubs in Southeast Asia, in Burma. I think it's Burma or Thailand, in the Golden Triangle area. Now, possibly that, but they're not native. They're South American in origin. They're not native. Naturalized means they've gone native from or
Yes.
gone wild from a cultivated plant. Uh, so it's conceivable that coca from Peru, they use it all the time, they still do. I've seen it in the markets down there. That it was brought from Peru by some transoceanic voyager, I don't know who, to Southeast Asia, and then taken in there, and then maybe the Egyptians were active in the Indian Ocean to some extent, at least. In that trade, it could have gotten its way into as far as Egypt. But they've found the nicotine, not the coca, but they found nicotine in really early burials in China and in Germany. So
It's getting out
it
there.
was around,
Yeah.
and these can't all be contaminations or errors on the part of the researchers and so on. There's just too many. There are too many of these occurrences.
Well, and we really only hear about the tobacco trade in more modern times in terms of shipping back to Europe and the kings of England and their snuff and all the things that they were getting from the
Yeah,
New World. But this evidence would suggest that it was
yeah, it
trafficked
was there
long
already.
before then.
It may not have gotten up to the wilds of Britain,
Right.
but apparently it was present in other parts of Europe earlier on, and pretty darn early on. The reciprocal of that is they have now found THC from marijuana, cannabis, in mummies in Peru, pre-Columbian mummies in the Andean region.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the
Yeah, get back onto that.
the navigation technology and the history of watercraft then, as it was moving forward.
Right. Watercraft technology goes way, way back in time. As I was explaining earlier, you had people going to remote islands tens of thousands of years ago. But the earliest, we have very little archaeological evidence regarding early watercraft. So I cannot give an exact date, much less even an approximation. I can say that certain kinds have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Rafts, for example, and the sailing raft, not just the ordinary raft that you use a pole with or a paddle, but fitting with a mast and sail. They're probably quite old in Indonesia, New Guinea area, that region of the world. And they could be sailed with what we call sprit sails, um, fairly even a little against the wind. And I think those go way back. And when I say way back, that's kind of a weaseling out of giving an exact figure, but certainly thousands of years BC. And I think they were among maybe the earliest really highly mobile craft that could have been utilized for long distance voyaging. And I think ultimately were for trans-Pacific voyaging.
And do we think that they were navigating by the stars at that point, or just letting the wind take them where they would? Or
Yeah, well, there certainly were accidental voyages, but navigation, again, we have no documentation of how far back that goes, except indirect in terms of, well, if they found this tiny island, they must have had the confidence to go out and search for it in the first place. And that means they must have had some kind of adequate navigational system to do it. And that would have been not only celestial navigation, but all sorts of other wayfinding techniques, reading of swells and waves, the direction they were going and what that implied in terms of upwind conditions and sea marks, maybe a hot spring coming up from the floor of the sea, reefs or shallows or water color according to water temperature or the origin of that water in a current. There are all sorts of methods of doing that, which I get into in some detail in my 2017 book. But the celestial aspect, it provided non-instrumental ways of knowing how to get around. This was not the ability to locate yourself on a chart. You couldn't say what the latitude and longitude was in terms
Right.
of figures. But the methods included latitude sailing. Uh, as you probably know, determination of longitude was difficult to do with any exactitude before a chronometer, a watch, a clock was an accurate one was devised. And I won't try to go into the technicalities of why that's the case, but it is true that longitude was somewhat difficult to get very exactly in pre-clock times. So if a sailor wanted to find a particular island target that he knew of and knew what the latitude of was, what he would do would be to get to that latitude, and I'll tell you in a moment how that was done. And then he'd reach that latitude along which the island lay, but he'd be sure to go to one side of it so he would miss it. And then he'd get that latitude. He'd sail down the latitude until he came to the island. How did he find the latitude and how could he be exact on that? That's because the dome of the heavens appears to move, and stars rise in the east and come across the dome and set in the west. And if you know what star goes over your island, you can just use that star and its successors during the night to determine where that latitude is with an accuracy up to 1 degree, 1.5 degrees degree of accuracy of locating that line of longitude, that parallel. So you know,
When did instrument navigation start? When did that begin, roughly?
uh,
With
well, it
sextants or
depends.
whatever they
Yeah,
used.
well, sextants are pretty late, but yeah, astrolabes and things like that. Some of those devices go back to classical times. You may have heard of the Antikythera mechanism. Now, this was a machine that was discovered in a ancient Greek period wreck uh, off the island of Antikythera off of Greece. Way back, I don't know, 100 years or so ago, it was discovered. And it was an extremely complex mechanism that was able to calculate movement of heavenly bodies and eclipses and stuff of that kind way back in Greek times. So they had quite a developed technology. This is the only one that's ever been found. And it was just a lucky fluke that it was found. So there may have existed some of these instruments pretty far back. That wasn't used specifically for navigation as far as we know, but astrolabes, they certainly go back into medieval times and maybe back even earlier than that. It was an measurement of angles was needed to determine the height above the horizon of a star to see what that angular distance was so you could see the North Star, we're talking about the pole star. So you can see how high or low above the horizon it was. And that angle tells you how far in angular distance you are, a latitudinal distance south of the North Pole. Uh, that's what that was for. And they had little cruder devices before that, but these are more accurate than
It's
the
just
earlier ones.
all of that, either instrument aided or in the older cases, without the aid of instruments, to be able to navigate on a huge open sea just by what you observe in the heavens,
Yeah,
to have to then remember which star was your island over or whatever.
yeah.
I mean, that to me is just mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling, but one has to keep in mind that this was what they were trained to do. There were training schools in this stuff. in the Polynesian Islands, the Micronesian Islands, and presumably back in the mainlands as well, training schools for navigational methods. And they memorized these stars, hundreds of stars, and what their trajectories were, what their paths were, and how they related to one another. And they didn't have too many diversions. There was no TV, no
True.
internet,
Yeah.
no cell phones.
Yeah. 18
So
hours a day
nothing to
studying.
do on a Saturday
Right.
night, but look at the stars.
And then it just becomes a question of how far do we want to sail following these stars? I mean, really, when you
Yeah.
talk transoceanic, it's still the same night sky. And you could see them going much further than just island hopping.
Yeah. I don't think they would have stopped. Um, the present day, I think, general feeling amongst the public is that, gosh, if I were given a boat and told to sail across the Atlantic, and what would I do? If I got out of sight of land, I wouldn't know what to do, you know? Well, these guys knew what to do.
Yeah.
And I think they had the confidence that it was no big deal. They didn't have any fear of going out there because they knew the latitude of their island. They knew how to find their way back. They knew the seasonality of the winds. They knew the currents, at least locally, and they gradually expanded their knowledge as they explored further and further. And so,
Yeah, that makes sense.
it was not a frightening thing as far
Yeah.
as they were concerned, and it was an adventurous thing. They liked the adventure of it. And also, young men, particularly, especially if they were sons of chiefs, but not the oldest sons, liked the idea of getting up a bunch of followers and going and trying to find a new island where he could be chief, this son, and have his guys and have their own place. And I think that was a major motivation on this exploration business.
Because the oldest son would take over.
Yeah, I'd take over the father's hereditary chief.
What are some of the civilizations, the cultures at the time that had the capability of transoceanic travel, and what kind of crafts, watercrafts, would they have been using?
The watercraft often corresponded to, but not necessarily corresponded to, culture areas like, say, China or Indonesia or whatever. So there's not a complete overlap, congruity between those phenomena. But there were several different traditions of watercraft that did create vessels or rafts that were capable of making these crossings. I mentioned the sailing raft category earlier on. These were not just crude rafts as we sometimes imagine rafts to be, but they were very well built and constructed, and they could have their sides built up too. And they had steering oars, they had sails. They used these dagger boards for steering as well as the oars. And they could carry a moderate number of people and goods. And flimsy though they may have looked, they I believe, were capable of crossings. We've had some experimental voyages done in them. Kon-Tiki is one, and many other ones as well, actually. So they've proven to be pretty capable for long distance ocean voyaging. They were found on the perimeters of southern and eastern Asia, and as I say, in Ecuador as well. So that's one tradition. You had the tradition that grew out of the canoe, probably bark canoes initially, but they were not very seaworthy.
Yeah.
And so when dugout canoes came along, and they go back probably to the Mesolithic, even before the Neolithic, it's long history of them. And we do have pretty good archaeological evidence of them back at least about 10,000 years. And they developed, they became increasingly large and sophisticated and aerodynamically or hydrodynamically designed.
And would they have been paddled?
They were paddled, but they also developed sailing canoes in which you had a mast or two masts and a sail or two sails, maybe even more sometimes. and very seaworthy, and and often fitted with outriggers that gave them stability and allowed them to sail closer to the wind as well. And so these are extremely efficient vessels. These sailing canoes of Polynesia, Micronesia, and it's by these sailing canoes that the first settlement of the Polynesian islands took place, followed probably later by double canoes, two canoes joined by
Oh, yes.
spars
Yeah.
and platform laid over those spars for carrying stuff and having a cabin and such. And these were, enormously efficient machines at sea, and they could take anybody anywhere in the world on the world's oceans. They may have even gotten south as far as seeing Antarctica, and they very likely got across the Pacific. They sailed west, as I've mentioned, as well, and maybe even to South America around the Horn of, not the Horn, the tip of South Africa, all the way to Paraguay. So these are all Austronesian speakers. They were the prime people in terms of the greatest expansion of seagoing and settling that the Earth has ever seen. But there are all sorts of other cultures that were very active. China is sometimes seen as a inward-looking culture and not exploratory and so on and so forth. But
some of them had to be.
Some of them had to be.
Yeah, they were humans.
And we have to recognize too that what happened in North China was not the same as what happened in South China, present-day South China. It was ethnically much more diverse. It was not initially Han Chinese. It was a mixture of different ethnicities. Probably the Austronesians originated there, Thai speakers originated there, and Hmong and so on and so forth. And there was a great seagoing tradition in South China. And so they handled a lot of the traffic that involved North China, but the North Chinese themselves didn't get as much involved. In India, there was also a lot of Indian Ocean traffic and also connections to China and the westward to the Indian Ocean coast of Africa, East Africa. There was a very, very brisk Indian Ocean trade. I mentioned the Romans getting into it. After they conquered Egypt, Cleopatra and all that, they took over the Alexandrian Greek Indian Ocean trade. And in the very first year, I think there were 150 Roman ships that went to India. And so the magnitude of this trade was very, very large. And it got bigger and bigger as time went on. China had trade relations not only with offshore islands like Japan and down to the Philippines. They also had a lot of trade down in Southeast Asia, a lot of influence in what used to be called Indochina. You find a lot of Chinese goods in Indonesia. You find Vietnamese bronzes going down into Indonesia all the way to New Guinea on a trade route that went down there. So these people were getting around. And this is just the stuff we know about.
That's another one of those terms, getting around.
Getting around.
It's
a navigational term. And this is just the stuff we recognize, we've discovered, which reflects the volume of, but when there were infrequent voyages to farther afield, the likelihood of finding any physical evidence of that is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And so the dearth of old world artifacts in the New World or New World artifacts in the Old World is not surprising, because they would have been carrying probably mostly archaeologically non-identifiable goods, like textiles that disappear in the archaeological record usually. And the volume of the trade would not have been so great as to have the likelihood of the survival of any diagnostic artifact take place. And a lot of artifacts are not diagnostic. They look the same over here as they do over there. They're commonly held by a lot of people, and you can't be sure you see this thing, and may have been made in India, but it looks just the same as one made in Ecuador, and so you don't know it's a foreign object. So there are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't expect to find much in the way of identifiable artifacts of Old World origin and New World sites in good stratigraphic context that could be dated. So I don't worry too much about that lack.
Yeah. Well, from what we've discussed here, there seems to be, at least for my money, of which I've paid literally nothing, um, but there sure seems to be an awful lot of reasons to think that what your book describes and what you essentially have been teaching and living for, lo, these many years, is that there was a lot going on in a transoceanic sense long before Columbus, long before the early explorers, and that's important. That's critical to what we're talking about.
Well, Columbus was just one among many who
Right.
crossed the oceans before and after. What his significance was is that we were dealing with a situation in which the European powers were trying to collect overseas colonies and claiming them by right of discovery. So that was something novel, actually. Secondly, we did get some improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, but that was not critical, but it was helpful. Third, we now have full written records because they wanted to advertise they had taken this new area by right of discovery, so they wanted everybody to know it. Prior to that, they wanted to keep trade secrets and political secrets, and so they weren't advertising it. So, if you want to call it that, was the sort of shifting point, and that it also established continuous overseas traffic, and
It does make sense. I mean, as you describe it, especially, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't ring true that it was just wham, Christopher Columbus just set off and found this new land.
and had all these novel ideas.
Like you say, he's basically just the first one that they promoted it and talked about it.
Yeah, well,
and
the
made a
myth
big
of
deal out
Columbus
it.
was created in a literary work, an alleged history by Washington Irving way back in the earlier part of the 19th century. He wrote a biography, so-called, of Columbus, and it had a lot of these stories in there that turn out not to have been
Well, this is a
factual.
man who wrote about a headless horseman, right?
Yeah.
So
well,
maybe we should take with a grain of salt.
yes, well, it was a real horseman anyway.
Ichabod Crane or Washington Irving?
Well, I mean, the horseman was a horseman with pumpkin head, but anyway.
With the pumpkin. I think that's a good place to end.
Maybe so.
Right there. Doctor, Professor, Stephen.
Herr Professor Doctor.
Thank you so much. Merci.
Dankeschön.
Gracias. Dankeschön. Exactly. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. You guys are fun to work with, and it's always a pleasure to be able to orate on my own subject of interest.
Anytime you want to orate, you find me. I'm a willing listener. This has been very relevant and good. We appreciate it. Thanks so much.